Thanks for the organizing committee, especially Professor Amos Horsen for the kind invitation for me to come here, and I believe that this is the best possible place here in the heart of Athens to discuss deep philosophical issues concerning the mind and the brain and their relationship. And this is precisely what I'm going to talk about, and this is what the hard problem is all about, the relationship between mind and the brain. And the core of that problem is really consciousness. And now consciousness is not merely an empirical or experimental problem for neuroscientists to solve, but we need to go all the way back to philosophy, and both to philosophers like Descartes and to current-day philosophers to really understand what is the problem, what is the big question about consciousness. And in general, explaining consciousness is currently regarded and acknowledged to be one of the major big questions for all of science to solve. One sign of this was that when the journal Science a few years ago listed what are the biggest unsolved questions for science, what we don't know as yet, then the problem of explaining consciousness was ranked very high in this list. Number one was, what is the universe made of? But already number two was the question of consciousness, and how do we understand the relationship between consciousness and the brain? What are the biological mechanisms of consciousness? So why is consciousness such a big question, one of the biggest questions in all of science? Why is it such an important question? Well, to understand this, we need to go back all the way to Descartes and the legacy that Descartes has left us with. Because there is something that Descartes showed that seems to have a lasting value that we cannot bypass even today. And that is that Descartes showed that whatever the fundamental nature of consciousness turns out to be, whatever the final solution to the mind-brain problem turns out to be, at least there is something that we already do know about consciousness. And this we know with absolute certainty. And this is the fact that consciousness really does exist. So this is Descartes' famous cogito argument, that so far as we have any conscious experiences, any conscious thoughts going on within our minds, we know that at least they are something. They are something rather than nothing, and we, as their subject, we also exist, and we are something rather than nothing. So we cannot coherently doubt the existence of our own consciousness. And we know our own consciousness more directly and more certainly than we know anything else in this world. In fact, we know everything else in this world via consciousness, via having conscious perceptions that bring us knowledge and information about the world. Well, this legacy of Descartes is often also acknowledged by current neuroscientists who study consciousness. For example, Christoph Koch, in his recent book, also stated pretty much the same thing when he wrote that without consciousness, there is nothing. The only way you experience your body and the world of mountains and people, trees and dogs, stars and music, is through your subjective experiences, thoughts, and memories. So consciousness is undoubtedly one of the big and one of the most important questions and one of the most important phenomena for us also personally. But why has consciousness been so difficult to study scientifically? And there has been a great skepticism whether consciousness can even be taken seriously as a scientific problem. And here we encounter another legacy. This is the legacy of behaviorism. Behaviorism was a very influential school of thought, especially in psychology, but also in related fields of science, especially in the early 20th century. And behaviorism was very clear about how or what we should do with consciousness in science. And that was, we shouldn't deal with it at all. The founding father of behaviorism in psychology, John B. Watson, wrote in the following way. Behaviorism claims that consciousness is neither a definable nor usable concept, that it is merely a word for the soul of more ancient times. No one has ever touched a soul or seen one in a test tube. Consciousness is just as unprovable, as unapproachable as the old concept of the soul. So the message here is that if you try to deal with consciousness scientifically, if you try to present a theory or experiment about consciousness, you are actually slipping back to Cartesian dualism. You are as worse off as talking about a non-physical, perhaps immortal souls here, and this is what we can't afford in real hard science. So the legacy of behaviorism was that we might slip back to Cartesian dualism if we accept consciousness as an actual real scientific problem. And that's why consciousness was widely avoided and even feared topic, especially in psychology in the last century. But currently things have changed, and consciousness is taken rather seriously now in many fields. But the question still remains, well, can we do some coherent scientific theory and experiments about consciousness? What is it that we are actually talking about when we talk about consciousness? Can we define the concept in any clear way? Well, currently, people who study consciousness in neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy, they have developed some concepts that they share and they try to keep clearly apart from each other so that the discussion would be more clear. So, for example, these three concepts are usually distinguished from each other: phenomenal consciousness, reflective or access consciousness, and self-awareness. And phenomenal consciousness is thought to be the most fundamental form of consciousness. And it is something very basic, very simple actually. It doesn't require language, it doesn't require concepts. It is just the ability to feel that you exist, the ability to feel our own existence in the here and now. And fundamentally, phenomenal consciousness consists of qualitative subjectivity. And philosophers often also call these qualia, qualities of experience. So when we feel that we exist, we always have some qualities of experience that are directly present for us in our minds. Reflective consciousness or access consciousness is something more cognitive. We would, in everyday language, probably call it thinking or inner speech or working memory. When we control our cognitive operations or carry out executive functions or voluntarily control our behavior and attention, then we are using our reflective consciousness. So it is a more higher level consciousness than phenomenal consciousness. And self-awareness is even higher than that, because in self-awareness we become aware of ourselves as a conscious self, as a conscious being that is embodied, so that we can recognize our own selves in the mirror, for example. And the mirror self-recognition test has been widely used to study which animal species can recognize themselves and have self-awareness. It also involves our ability to travel mentally in time, to go back in autobiographical memories and understand it is the same conscious self that it existed in the past and also think about the future, mentally simulate the future. So, for example, a patient suffering from global amnesia loses this ability to mentally travel in time and is trapped in this one here and now moment in phenomenal consciousness. Another way of dividing consciousness is to talk about consciousness as a state. So either we are in an unconscious state or in a conscious state, and then to talk about specific contents of consciousness, specific experiences. And for example, Stephen Lawrence has presented this model about the levels and contents of consciousness, so that when the levels of consciousness are very low, like in coma and general anesthesia, also the contents of consciousness are not there, they are absent. Whereas in conscious wakefulness, the level of consciousness is high, and also we have very rich contents of consciousness at the same time. But most of the philosophical problems of explaining consciousness then have to do with this, the most simple form of consciousness, the mere existence of qualitative subjectivity, our ability to feel something, to feel that we exist. And now there is a kind of a conflict or potential conflict between how consciousness is typically defined in clinical contexts, because there it is typically defined or measured as responsiveness to stimuli. So, for example, when testing patients suffering from disorders of consciousness, what is typically being tested are simple behavioral responses like eye-opening, verbal responses, or motor responses, and then based on them, or partly on them, a diagnosis may be given. But now the question may be raised, well, are behaviorally unresponsive patients also necessarily unconscious in the phenomenal sense? So are they necessarily devoid of subjective experiences? Or can there be a dissociation between this internal ability to feel something, to feel that you exist, and external behavioral responsiveness? And about 10 years ago, a very groundbreaking study showed that indeed these can be dissociated, and Owen and others published this study in Science, and they came up with a very ingenious task. First they gave it to healthy volunteers, 2 mental imagery tasks. Think about playing tennis, or think about walking around in your home and looking out of the windows. And then they looked at the fMRI responses to these mental imagery tasks. So people were doing this inside their minds. Then they give the same task to patients in the vegetative state who didn't respond to anything at all. So they had no idea if they have even heard the instruction. But it turned out they found one case who responded so that the evidence shows that this person was actually carrying out the mental imagery tasks. And this finding led then to much larger studies where the question was, okay, how big a proportion of patients who may be diagnosed as being in the vegetative state might actually be internally conscious, even though they are behaviorally unresponsive. And in this follow-up study, over 50 patients were studied, and 5 cases were found who showed also this kind of internal brain activity consistent that they were carrying out the mental imagery task. And in this study, they also developed a way to communicate with the patient, so that they told the patient that, I will ask you simple questions. If your answer is yes, think about playing tennis. If your answer is no, think about the other task. So they asked this patient, is your father's name Alexander? And he correctly answers yes. Is your father's name Thomas? And he correctly answers no, by the mental imagery tasks. And remember, this patient cannot respond behaviorally at all. So this is the only way to communicate with the patient. Well, this again led to the idea that, well, we can ask all sorts of questions of these patients. For example, this patient was then asked clinically more relevant questions, like, can you feel any pains? And the patient responded again with the mental imagery task, no, I don't feel any pains. So this has opened up an entire industry of possibilities to first of all find out how big a proportion of unresponsive patients are internally conscious, and secondly, how can we communicate with those patients. So this, I think, has been a very important reminder that it's so important how precisely we define what consciousness is, and we shouldn't mix it up or define it as behavioral responsiveness, because it has this internal subjective aspect to it that may be dissociated from behavioral responsiveness altogether. Okay, but now I come to the hard problem then. And the hard problem is precisely related to this phenomenal consciousness, our ability to have the feeling that we exist, that we have these qualitative, subjective experiences. And now the problem is, well, how does the brain create a feeling of existence? How could something like the brain, a biological organ, create something so strange? And the philosopher David Chalmers in the 1990s, he coined the term the hard problem to ask precisely this question. How and why could qualitative subjective experiences be produced by any kind of neural or physical processes in the brain? It seems that we don't have any theory that would really give an idea how this sort of a process could happen, that these subjective experiences are created. And we can formulate this question also in a more specific form. That was the general form. In the specific form, we can also ask, well, we have so many different types of subjective experiences, different qualities of experience. How could one type of neural activity produce one type of qualitative experience and another type? And we would need, for every different kind of experience, we would need a different kind of neural basis as well. So how is it possible that one type of activity becomes the redness of red, another type the blueness of blue, a third type the hurtfulness of pain, and so on indefinitely, because we have such a rich qualitative life of subjective experiences. Another way to put pretty much the same problem is to call it the explanatory gap. And this term was coined by the philosopher Joseph Levine already in the 1980s. And he pointed out that the relationship between consciousness and brain is very special, because we cannot even imagine any sort of explanatory mechanism that would mediate from the brain to consciousness. That it's very difficult to imagine what sort of a mechanism that could be. And this is very unlike from common cases where we have a mechanism, well, we can understand why liquid water becomes ice because we know how the molecules behave at the microscopic level. We understand these days even the mechanisms of natural self-replication, which 100 years ago still seemed like some sort of almost miraculous event. But now we know there is a mechanism, a step-by-step mechanism, very complex of course, but a mechanism nevertheless. And there is no mysterious gap there, but we can understand how this happens. Or take some phenomenon that might look like this is something very ghostly going on, that bioluminescence, that organisms emit a weird cold light in the depths of the ocean. But also in this case, we perfectly well know what the mechanism is. We also know that what is being produced is just ordinary photons of light. It's nothing ghostly or spooky being produced. So we have a perfect gapless explanation of what's going on. But not so when we come to the question of how do neural activities in the brain become subjective experiences in our consciousness. Here is the gap. And actually, it seems like here are two problems wrapped in one. And one of the problems is precisely the problem of there being no mechanism, no imaginable mechanism, no known mechanism. What is the nature of the conversion? What is the causal mechanism? What could it be? How could a brain activity of any kind somehow transform itself to the feeling that I exist, or to some qualitative experience in consciousness. So this seems to be still something that we cannot account for, or perhaps even imagine how it could be accounted for. But then there is a second side to this problem also. The nature of this subjective experience, the nature of phenomenal consciousness. What is the nature of this phenomenon? What is being produced when the brain produces the feeling of existence? And this is still pretty unclear as well. Philosophers would call this the question of the fundamental nature of consciousness. What is the ontology, or what is the metaphysics? What is the fundamental nature of consciousness? And traditionally, of course, well, Descartes tried to give an answer to this, and his answer was that, well, consciousness is res cogitans. It is a non-physical substance, and its basic feature is to have these conscious experiences and thoughts, and it is not dependent on the brain. It exists independently of it. It's just in interaction, causal interaction with the brain. But of course, the Cartesian dualist picture has lots of problems, as we all know. But does Descartes have the hard problem as well? What would Descartes say about the hard problem and the explanatory gap? Well, he would say, no problem, because this is not a problem for a Cartesian dualist. The hard problem and the explanatory gap, they stem from the fact that we accept a materialistic starting point, because these questions ask us, how does the brain produce this weird thing called consciousness? But of course Descartes says, well, it doesn't produce it. That's why it's so hard to find the mechanism, because there isn't any. So it wouldn't be a problem for dualism. So maybe we have to grant at least one point to good old Descartes, that he got rid of these problems. Of course he has many other problems still remaining. Well, currently the discussion in philosophy and neuroscience is, however, not in Cartesian dualism. There are very few people who would explicitly defend something like that, but rather I would say what are the currently most popular or discussed ideas are information theories of consciousness and then emergent materialistic theories of consciousness. So I will say a couple of words about them, and perhaps the most famous information theory of consciousness currently is proposed by Giulio Tononi, a neuroscientist, and he has put forward what he calls an integrated information theory of consciousness, where he claims that consciousness is identical with a certain type of information, which he calls integrated information. And he also claims that we can calculate the amount of integrated information in any complex system, including the brain and many other complex systems. He calls this amount of integrated information in a system phi. It's phi value. And whenever the phi value is above 0, the system has at least some quantity of consciousness. Well, I have to say I find this theory quite problematic for several reasons. Well, one reason is that if we identify consciousness with information, there is nothing specifically biological or neural or neurophysiological about consciousness, because information is an abstract concept, and any system at all that carries the right type of information therefore is necessarily conscious. It doesn't have to be at all anything to do with neurons or neurophysiological activities or anything like that. And that's why actually the information integration theory of Tononi has been criticized, that it leads also to the view that actually smartphones, computers, and the internet, they also turn out to be conscious beings, because their amount of integrated information, their phi value, is above 0. So so you have to accept these sorts of consequences of the theory, or you have to give up that theory. Well, CONy is ready to argue that consciousness is widely spread across all sorts of systems and creatures. Of course, maybe possible, but I don't find it very, very plausible at all. So I would rather defend what I would call an emergent materialist idea about consciousness. And I have been defending this kind of a theory, what I call biological realism about consciousness, which sees consciousness as an emergent biological phenomenon. So what does it mean to say that consciousness is an emergent biological phenomenon? Sometimes emergence is thought to be something very spooky and mysterious, but there is a completely non-mysterious way to understand what emergence is, and it happens in all sorts of biological systems. Generally, the idea is that biological systems in general consist of multiple levels of organization, higher levels and lower levels, and to understand any complex system, you need to understand what are the levels that it consists of, and you need to understand the interlevel connections between different kinds of phenomena, and then you can explain some high-level phenomenon by going through a hierarchy of different lower-level phenomena. And now the notion of emergence at a very general level, nothing to do with consciousness, can be defined in this explanatory model as simply a relationship between lower and higher levels of physical organization. So there are emergent phenomena which bring something new into the world. They cannot be reduced back to their base phenomena, but we can understand how they work if we understand perfectly how the higher level and the lower level are connected to each other. So in this picture, consciousness will turn out to be a higher level phenomenon, but it is just yet undiscovered in any objective manner. Just like in 19th century biology, it was completely mysterious how living organisms can be made out of dead bits of matter, because we didn't have any molecular biology, we didn't have any genetics. So lots of levels of organization remain totally unknown. In the same manner, there are completely unknown levels of neurophysiological organization in the brain between consciousness and between what we know currently about the brain. And I believe this is the solution to find those undiscovered levels of organization. And if this approach turns out to be on the right track, then conscious experiences are emergent structures in the brain. And in their metaphysical status, they are just like molecules or cells, higher level biological phenomena. So will neuroscience then be able to solve the brain consciousness problem and the heart problem and the explanatory gap? Well, I am optimistic about it. Like I said, I believe we need to find those missing levels of organization between what we currently know about the brain and the higher level where consciousness and the feeling of existence are created. So we just are not there yet. But there are also philosophers who are and remain very pessimistic about this. For example, Colin McGinn is one of these philosophers, and he says about the problem like this. Somehow we feel the water of the physical brain is turned into the wine of consciousness, but we draw a total blank on the nature of this conversion. So that this is some kind of a miraculous, spooky, supernatural, almost supernatural phenomenon that happens when brain activities turn or are converted into consciousness. So like in this old cartoon, maybe this could be like what is going on in the brain, and this is what we experience, and in the middle there is a strange miracle. Well, I believe this should be filled in by these missing levels of organization that future neuroscience still needs to discover. If this project fails, nobody knows yet who is right, the optimists or the pessimists. If it fails, then maybe we need to go back to Descartes and ask, okay, so what is really going on here? How is consciousness and brain related to each other? Okay, thank you.